Okay, I welcome Victoria Sakti, who will discuss on aging in context of protracted migration and displacement, perspective from Southeast Asia. And I thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks again for inviting us, and especially for Mata and for organizing this. It's a really nice occasion also to come back and reflect on data that I recently collected. So, yeah, thanks for this opportunity. The title of the talk is a little bit misleading. I think Mega and I, we were thinking in terms of like how to make the title broad enough to enable either she or I can present. So despite the title being Perspectives from Southeast Asia, you will soon find out that it's more about Indonesia and Timor-Leste, where my focus is on. So we can start now. In their edited volume on population aging in Southeast Asia, Arifin and Ananta divide depictions of older persons as being a liability by foregrounding them as society's new emerging assets. They do this by examining the diverse care regimes and financial support countries in Southeast Asia are investing in and spending on their aging communities. They argue that these aspects are key to better management of vulnerable groups of a population. Now, Southeast Asia is among the regions in the world where the number of older persons is growing most rapidly and multifaceted and dynamic in terms of the economy, social, cultural, and political dimensions. The region provides a multitude of experiences for people who are growing old in this region, either within or across member states. Migration can have a complex impact on aging issues, including on a country's preparedness and resources in dealing with the challenges that come with aging populations. When we take Singapore as an example, which is the richest country in the region and whose population is the only one in the region that can be categorized as old, migration influences the policies financing and accommodating older people, while at the same time enabling later life migrants to secure better financial support for themselves and for their families back home. My colleague Mega Amrith, who is discussing to this panel, can add more critical insight on this case with examples from her own fieldwork. Her project particularly explores the lived experiences of older labor migrants living through protracted temporary migration in Singapore. So my own project looks at a different kind of migration, and in a context that provides different infrastructural support for older persons, as well as a new set of challenges. My research deals with protracted forced migration, or displacement, of East Timorese diasporas living in Indonesia. By adopting the phenomenon of aging as an analytical lens, I look at what happens when the experience of an initially temporary displacement or state of displacement becomes a permanent reality. Some of the questions that I explore in my research include, for example, how is it to grow old in a politicized context and away from or between or across culturally and spiritually significant places? How do older diasporas experience the option of return or non-return? What would aging in the context of forced migration look like? And what are the emerging care practices across and within borders in this context? I also am interested in looking at the interplay between aspects such as temporality, mobilities and immobilities, and micropolitics of memory, as well as the bodily aspects that are attached with growing old, and how they interplay with later life decisions, including on matters of death and burial. And what do the experiences of older displaced East Timorese tell us about aging and displacement in general and globally? So in exploring these questions, I find it also important to understand how states are taking care of their old and who belongs in this category and who does not. I carried out research in an Indonesian province located in the eastern side, which is called East Nusa Tenggara. I'll show you a map later because I'll show it to you now. So, on the inset, that's a map of Indonesia, which is the north of Australia, to give you a better picture. And the bigger picture is located just on that part. And it's an island that's divided in two. So the eastern part, or the blackened part of the map, is now Timor-Leste, which has been independent since 2001 formally, 2002 formally. So sorry, but separated from Indonesia in 1999. So let me get back to you about financial and economic matters. Now, Indonesia's GDP is only around 5% that of Singapore, but the number of older persons in Indonesia is 35 times more than in Singapore. In proportion, though, the number of older persons in Indonesia is less than 9% compared to their entire population. So this does not make them an aging population. In fact, it makes them categorically a useful country, similar to Dora's case in Brazil. Now, the province that I work in, East Nusa Tenggara, is one of the poorest province, if not the poorest province in Indonesia. Their spending depends largely on state budget that is allocated to them to provide, among others, for healthcare, social welfare, and financial support for older persons. The number of older persons, particularly those belonging to the East Timorese diaspora or former refugees, is not insignificant. And East Timorese refugees, with whom I've worked with since 2010, particularly older members of this group, experience everyday discrimination, lacks of means of income generation due to non-existent land tenure, and poverty compared to local or host populations. The configuration of all these variables raised the question of how older members of the East Timorese diasporas cope with growing old in this context. Now, before I go on to explain more about my fieldwork, let me briefly introduce you to the historical aspect of the displacement. Sorry, I have like these areas where I did my research. So my research was on the entire island, in western part of Timor, which belongs to Indonesia, and the eastern part of Timor as well. So I worked with among the displaced communities, and I followed also their family networks in Timor-Leste. So in 1999, following the UN-supervised referendum in Timor-Leste, about 240,000 people fled violence. And this violence was an outbreak that resulted from 25 years of occupation by the Indonesian military in East Timor, and 240,000 people of 1 million population of East Timor fled to neighboring West Timor. And one of the reasons for the violence also, or why the violence had become so significant, is because the agents who were carrying out violence were East Timorese themselves. And these East Timorese were recruited into militia groups by the Indonesian military. So the war was created in a sense to make the impression that it was a civil war, and local East Timorese were fighting their own neighbors, were killing their people from their own communities, and that had led to deep-rooted conflict, which was not reconcilable during the Reconciliation and Truth Commission period in 2002 to 2005. In 1999 to 2002, East Timorese who fled to West Timor gained status of being refugees. And this status ended after the UN made how do you call it? Like an ultimatum. Either people return back to Timor-Leste and are repatriated safely, or people who choose to remain in West Timor do so and take up Indonesian citizenship. The other option was to transmigrate to different parts of Indonesia. So around 90% of the refugees indeed repatriated back to Timor-Leste, and 10% of them stayed. So the numbers are still a bit confusing. Some people, some data shows that it's around 10,000 or 28,000 former refugees still remaining in West Timor today. But some estimates, which are made by former militias, estimate between 110,000 to 200,000. So there's no accurate number, and I think that the reason why there is no accurate number makes it also the more interesting in making former refugees or the exiled population strengthening their claim. In return for supporting Indonesia, former militias and their families remain in Indonesia, and they were promised jobs, land tenure, and housing. So around 22,000 people are still living in former refugee camps today, and the condition or basic services that are provided in these camps vary very much. And a lot of them now, which is 20 years later, has also developed into small villages and established neighborhoods themselves. So the East Timorese diasporas in Indonesia, they embody a part of history that both countries would prefer to forget. The impunity former militias enjoy, alongside the Indonesian military, of past human rights violations perpetuates mistrust against them. And this mistrust is coming from the local population in West Timor as well as the population in Timor-Leste. The thing about Timorese society, which I find a lot of relevance also to countries in the African context, is the importance put on kinship ties and the importance of lineage. So in day-to-day life in East Timor, people also carry out divinations to their ancestors, and they believe that ancestors are protecting their future and present as well as past life in terms of establishing or strengthening their lineage. The war in 1999, the conflict in 1999, broke a lot of kinship bonds. And my PhD thesis focused more on seeing the long-term effects of that and how people were trying to reestablish bonds that were broken. And 20 years later, the people that I worked with just recently gave me an idea or triggered my thinking of how prolonged displacement could perhaps, this is something that I still need to develop, but it's becoming to develop into more of a condition of displacement being an everyday reality. And this, I argue, we can see more clearly through the lens of aging, I guess, bringing in the temporality aspect. I've so far carried out 2.5 months of planned 6 months ethnographic research on multiple sites in East Nusa Tenggara, Indonesia, which is West Timor, to make it easy, as well as Timor-Leste. And I've previously conducted long-term research since 2010 in these areas for my doctoral research. So before going to Timor this time, I met with 2 demographers, Indonesian demographers, and they keenly discussed issues to do with population aging in Indonesia. Their opinion is that population aging should not be under the mandate in terms of policy making, which is the case now, should not be in the mandate under Social Welfare's ministry, but instead it should be under the Indonesian Ministry of National Development. They argue that it has to be so in order to strengthen the argument that older persons are emerging assets. And I didn't understand particularly what the differences between interventions from the social ministry and from the national development ministry, but I thought it was pretty interesting to see that that they were very keen on that. And as academics, they have also only started now to take part in meetings on policy making. So when I traveled to West Timor for fieldwork, I paid visits to both offices. The first was the National Development Plan in the provincial level, and the social affairs in the provincial level as well. So my first visit to the former, I met with the department head, and I explained to him, I described him my project, and was very excited about, like, okay, what's being done now for older persons in this province in general, and what's being done for older refugees. I wanted to know everything, like how were they being incorporated in terms of development planning for the next 5 years. And he was listening to me patiently, but I also noticed he was shifting very uncomfortably, like very nervously. And I asked him for his response, and he said, "I'm so sorry, but it seems like from where you're from, which is Europe in this context, aging seems to be an important issue. We're not really focusing on aging now. We're focusing on poverty reduction or poverty alleviation and targeting youthful parts of the community, of the society." So it's not something that we're talking about now, and we don't have any interventions. But yeah, we do have we do hope that the elderly will benefit from other projects aimed at alleviating poverty in certain families, or they will benefit from projects or interventions that mainstream gender and are targeting poverty, female head of families who are poor. So it was mostly a trickle-down effect that was hoped for the older population. So I came out from that meeting feeling a little bit discouraged, and I thought, okay, let's go see it, and let's go see what the social ministry has to say in the provincial level. I came to the building, which was very difficult to find, and was literally surprised. The building was in a state of near collapse. So it was in such a poor state that in different parts of the buildings, you can see the bones poking out. So in the room that we had our meeting, it was in such a poor state that they said that people aren't usually allowed to work there or to meet there. And I was like, oh, okay, thanks. So, but I guess it goes to show how the social affairs, the representation of the Indonesian state in the province level was in that building, basically, and that building was in a near collapse condition. And it gave me the impression, although I believe that they might do much better than what the building expresses or gives the impression of, but it shows also the interventions that are done by in providing social welfare, including also support for the elderly, which is concentrated in that fund, was much like their office, was not much. So it struck me how these ideas or statements were somehow working against each other. First of all, the statement that older people can be seen as asset or as an asset rather than liability, given correct measures of financing. And second of all, lack of resources and urgency in dealing with population aging in rural areas where the main issue has been poverty alleviation for years now. And thirdly, how poorly the state invests in their own institutions, mandated to care for, among others, their elderly. And these problems manifested in what I observed in the field among older East Timorese diaspora. However, the scope of their concerns, the scope of the concerns of people I spoke with during research was much beyond aging-related monetary issues. It is, of course, an important issue about finances and how to afford elderly people in our community. But for older persons, they have other issues as well, which is even more secondary to the question of how we can afford older persons. So it led me to question, how were older people and their families dealing with aging issues on their own? What are these aging issues in the context of prolonged displacement and amid memories of violence? So in the remaining of my talk, I will highlight some of these issues that I've observed, and they're pretty fragmented, so I have to apologize in advance. One of the, excuse me. So life and displacement 20 years after was, I think in my observation, it's pretty striking to see or to listen to different or shifting narratives. 10 years ago, when I first worked with people in displacement, I think main narratives were focused on the issue of politicizing their displacement, politicizing their status, and also politicizing return, the question of return. One of the reasons is that the displaced East Timorese are also seen as exiled communities. They are seen by the East Timorese in Timor-Leste as traitors, or those who have attacked their own brothers and sisters and land. For the East Timorese, land is an important aspect of life. Land, it is through land that they sustain their lives, and it is also through land that they express their connection to ancestors. And these people are detached from their land. So it was always interesting for me to see how that affects their ideals, their imaginations of their identity also as being East Timorese. And life and displacement, very much so like in Timor-Leste, is focused on family. So when we work on older persons, it's never working with older persons in isolation, but it's a lot to do also with seeing how their lives are interlinked with their children's or their ancestors or their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, for example. In the many homes that I visited, you would see pictures of families hanging, pictures of families who they are living with currently, as well as families who are back home in Timor-Leste. And in one picture, just a note, these pictures have been consented by my interlocutors to be shown. And in this picture, for example, a family of Senora Maria here, 80-year-old former refugee in Timor-Leste, also shows a little bit of a picture of her son who is now back home in Timor-Leste. So these families, they don't also, they're not isolated from other members of families who have returned home. So people are dispersed across displacement and the homeland. Like I said earlier, rituals and symbols that can express their bond with ancestors have major importance in everyday life. So there's everyday, for example, when people are experiencing hardship, it is often the case that people would provide sacrifices or animal sacrifices to their ancestors. And this is very much bounded to significant places. So in displacement, what I have also found occurred in many families is that they would move or build their own sacred houses where they could carry out these rituals. I found that very interesting, and this is a picture of one of these new altars that they built just behind their house, and these two are showing me the place. And like I said, also land has always been important, is an important part of Timorese everyday life to sustain. And this is it's actually smaller than the picture gives the impression of. This is just in front of Senora Maria's house, and she is nearing 90 years old and has never gone back. And one of the reasons is because she is too frail. She says that she worries that she might not be able to, her body won't sustain the travel back, and traveling back is really difficult also. So she works every day on her field, and it's a very small patch of land in comparison to the sizes that people would normally have back home. And what I also found that because also of the lack of financial support from the state as well as from their families, older persons are actively engaged in income generation in a very small scale or in smaller scales than they are used to. For example, they would keep animals and for selling one day. And what I also found I think very interesting is how work characterizes your identity as a migrant. Like in Hamidu's talk, I found that also very much the case in Timor, among the East Timorese diasporas, is that because they have no land, because they have no tenure, they have to take up hard labor that is not their field. So Mama Kaili, in this picture, she wakes up in the morning at 5 a.m. and walks for 3 hours to break stone. And after 1 month, what she has, the result of breaking stone every day with a couple of other elderly, they can sell that, and that's one way of getting money. But then after that, she would also go another 3 hours in one direction to collect firewood. So like these are the type of hard labor that does not necessarily characterize their identity as being farmers, but they have to take up. One of the, I think, finding that, what I found a lot about interventions in terms of state interventions in terms of the elderly or related to the elderly is much concentrated on healthcare. And I followed a health worker who was doing his outreach to the elderly population in West Timor, and people were focused on prescriptions and measuring stuff, so measuring blood pressure. So that was really interesting. That was seen as the intervention for the elderly and nothing beyond that. Oh, I think I pressed something. Wait, sorry. One of the issues. Yeah. I can just go on, right? Yeah. So the question of return was also something that is salient among my interlocutors. And there's many reasons for people of taking the decision to finally return or not. And I probably don't have time to get into that, and I'm happy to answer any questions about the question of return, but it relates to the immobilities that certain people, it relates to the immobilities that certain people have. Oh, I think I lost several slides. I'm sorry. Okay, there were a couple of slides still with pictures. But then the question of return relates very much with the issue of immobility that comes with their identity as being exiled. And another emerging issue relates to death and burial. It is very important for people also to be buried in their homeland, as this is part of their belief that one day their descendants will take care of them as they go on to the afterlife. But the thing is, some people cannot return anymore due to their past crimes during the conflict. And now the narratives that I'm hearing is that they are happy, they now would like to be buried in West Timor, in their site of where they have lived, where they have resettled. And this was also important. This is not, it's not insignificant. It's a way also perhaps for them to claim land after life. And one intervention from the social ministry is, that has been appreciated, is providing a cemetery. And this cemetery, the social cemetery, is often cited by my interlocutors as saying, yes, we will be buried there, and we also now carry out rituals in the cemetery instead of going to Timor-Leste. And in another research in Indonesia, in Yogyakarta, my husband did research with street children and street communities in Indonesia, and the social cemetery in that context was always stigmatized as being the cemetery for people who have no name and who are communities exiles. So it's a different framing, I guess, in terms of this context. And also one point that I'd like to still slip in before cutting is narratives of multiple displacement experiences. In the case of Timor-Leste, this isn't the first war. This is the third or fourth war or conflict. And people have been displaced many times, and some of the elderly have been captured more than one time, and they have lived in captivation for periods of time. People have also lived in the jungle for between 1 to 4 years, and that has shaped their decisions of never coming back, because it is something that is frightening to them to experience once again. And one thing that I do want to follow up again in my next fieldwork in a couple of weeks is this issue of old age, long-term displacement, and memories of violence and mental health. This was something that was striking at the end of my research, but also was, again, it didn't come up to the agenda of interventions for the elderly. I guess to conclude now, it's very, like I said, it's very fragmented. It's also because I'm taking this more as an opportunity to just reflect on the things that I've gathered so far. But I guess what I was trying to do was to see how the state is financing or not financing, but maybe conceptualizing ways of dealing with population that is aging, and seeing how people who are aging but are in a more marginalized state are also dealing with the everyday reality, and seeing that in terms of prolonged displacement. So I will leave you to that, and I'm looking forward to any comments or questions. Thank you very much.